Here to discuss ISIS tactics is Otago University international relations expert Robert Patman. Robert, good morning to you.
Good morning, Paul.
This is interesting, isn't it? It's a slight change from ISIS. We'll talk Tunisia. This isn't about gaining territory. What is it about?
It's not a change in strategy, but it's certainly a refinement of tactics that were adopted. In September last year, ISIS publicly advocated what they called lone wolf attacks on the United States, France and its allies. And I would think Tunisia fits into that category, where you have someone who was unknown to the Tunisian intelligence services who suddenly carried out an appalling attack using a combination of automatic gunfire and also hand grenades.
This is someone who has been entirely radicalised by ISIS over the internet, by the sound of it.
Yes, and that is part of the worry about the ISIS challenge, because they do seem to be quite successful in winning recruits from countries like Australia and New Zealand, as well as other Western countries and the rest of the world. It's believed, for example, Paul, that although Tunisia is a success story in many respects, a reasonably stable democracy and has secular politics, nevertheless, 3,000 Tunisians have been attracted sufficiently by the social media presented by ISIS to go and fight on ISIS' behalf.
All right, so what we've seen in Tunisia, is this just stepping up one side of ISIS's campaign, or can we read something positive into this? Is it perhaps that ISIS are feeling really threatened on their own territory, that the airstrikes are having some impact, and so that's why they're ramping up other strategies?
I think there's a definite linkage. The reason they announced that they were publicly advocating lone wolf attacks was because they felt that countries like the United States, Britain, Australia were involved in the airstrikes, as certainly the United States and the UK are, and they decided to take the battle from the Middle East into the backyard of the countries concerned, namely the West. They're sending a message. They're trying to intimidate the citizens and governments of the Western world, and they're trying, obviously, to put pressure on them to desist from cutting back their campaign against ISIS in the Middle East.
Let's remind people what ISIS actually want, because quite often there have been many interviews about this, there have been many reports done, but quite often people avoid just cutting to the chase and saying, what is their end game? What is it?
Well, they want a global caliphate. They're very ambitious. They're unusual, or they're distinctive compared with Al-Qaeda, because they had a global vision like Al-Qaeda, or sort of global Islam, under their leadership. But the difference is they've established a territorial base in the Middle East, and they're using that base. They've also got about 50 to 60,000 fighters under arms. They're an effective fighting force, and despite air attacks by the United States and its allies, they haven't lost the gains they've largely made in the ground. They still control Mosul. They captured Ramadi recently, so they're quite a formidable force.
All right, so make no mistake about it. They want to take over the world, and they will stop at nothing to do it.
Well, that's what their propaganda says, but you're only as good as your opponents allow you to be, and so far they have not yet really met concerted opposition. I think both militarily and politically, more pressure needs to be put on them.
So, in a sense, these Tunisian attacks, like the Tunisian attack, could backfire on them, in that it could rally support against them.
It could, but at the moment, many of the Middle Eastern states do not seem to be able to mobilise together to fight ISIS. And in a sense, Tunisia is a vulnerable target because its economy depends critically on tourism. 15% of Tunisia's gross national product each year comes from tourism. And, tourism, if it dries up, is bad news for Tunisia. It could have political consequences if its economy declines.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for joining us. Robert Patman, Otago University international relations expert. Always good to talk to you, Robert.